Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Hey, this is our podcast about sailing the East Coast of the United States. In some episodes, we'll focus on passages and destinations, and in other episodes, we'll talk about boats, equipment, and techniques. And when we come across an interesting individual, we'll try to get them to be a guest on the show. Hey, Mike, I think this past summer you were in Monaco, weren't you?
I was. And this is, again, yet another example of a short question and a long answer. But yes, yes is the short answer. We did some traveling this summer to places with amazing sailing. And once again, and please don't judge me, my friend, I didn't set foot on a sailboat. But yes, our European travels took us to Sardinia, which is an island off the coast of Italy, some may know, with some great sailing on that. It's really amazing. And people think, oh, you went to Sardinia. It's like a 2-hour flight from here. You know, it's like for you going to Chicago, you know?
Yeah.
But it's this beautiful island. It's part of Italy, but the Sardinians don't call us Italian, right? It's its own unique culture, but really beautiful and great food and nice people. So that was cool. We did go to the south of France. We kind of based ourselves in Nice. Then we went to Monaco and kind of back and traveled along the coast a little bit. Saw a lot of amazing boats there. Oof. Like, I mean, really big, some of them. We went to Normandy on the northern coast of France. Very different feel than the Mediterranean. Yeah, and that was like a 7-hour train trip. I like to take the train, and that was really nice train trip, like beautiful views and relaxing. And then we were in Paris, and there's really not a lot of sailing in Paris, but there's a lot of houseboats there. And I think that's a nice lead into today's guest, Bela. Who do we have today?
Yeah, well done, Mike. Well done. So today we have a guest is Merrill Charette, and he's interesting from two perspectives. He co-founded an online marketplace for marine-related services called ShipShape.pro, and he's also the host of a podcast called ShipShape International Ocean Insights, which is an interesting podcast. But also, the thing that intrigued me about him is he lives on his boat. So living on a boat's no big deal, but he lives on his boat full time in Boston. Now, we all know that Boston's quite a nice place to live in July and August and maybe even June and September. But man, in January and February, it's got to be cold. So I said to myself, I got to talk to this Merrill guy. I mean, he must have some good stories about living on a boat in a cold climate, and what do you do to sort of, live like that? How does it work? Because I was really intrigued by it. So, we had a great conversation.
Yeah. I lived in beautiful Norwood, Mass, on the kind of the southwest side of Boston, one of the suburbs in the late 80s and early 90s. So I am well acquainted with winter in the Boston. I actually worked out on one of the harbor islands. Really knew how the wind could really blow cold in the winter on the coast there in Boston. So sounds cool in terms of the business. I'm always interested in online platform businesses, but also really cold in terms of living on a boat during the winter. So I'm totally interested. You got me hooked, Bela. Let's get right to it.
Hello, Merrill. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bela. I'm excited to get this going.
Yeah. So I think you sent me an email, and one of the things that intrigued me about the email you sent me was you said you were a liveaboard sailor. So that's no big deal, but you're a liveaboard sailor in Boston 12 months out of the year, which means it gets cold. So that intrigued me because you don't run into many liveaboards who are, spend the winter north of the Mason-Dixon line, so to speak. So tell us a little bit about that.
First off, I'll say that Boston has a surprisingly vast community of liveaboards that stay there year round. And so it's actually quite surprising. And there is a community, and at times it almost seems that the winter strengthens the community bond because everyone has this shared experience of it kind of sucks. And up in New England is also when the nor'easters come, which are the northern hurricanes. And so a lot of the community will join together and have storm parties, and so it's fun. But living on a boat in the winter, it's really not that bad. Honestly, my opinion is that the summer is way harder than the winter.
Because you can always put on more layers of clothes, but you can only take so much off.
Exactly. And I have a Tashing Toshiba 36, so it's known for its beautiful teak decks. But during
Mm.
the summer, boy, it lights up like the third level of hell.
Yeah, that teak really does absorb heat, doesn't it, from the sun?
Yeah, there was one time I was sitting in the boat and it had to have been like 110 degrees in that thing. And with those teak decks, how they're screwed into the deck, every now and then one of the screws will expand and it'll be almost like the sound of a shotgun right in the room. There was one time and it was so hot and I was just laying there. I had a cat on board and the cat's just laying on the table, and all of a sudden I started to hear this like creaking sound, and I like look over, and all of a sudden boom, this huge explosion. It was such an explosion that all the dust had lifted off of everything and the whole boat just became dusty.
Wow. Wow. So here, I'm curious about, what do you do in the winter? So I've been on my boat when it's been like, I think maybe like 40 degrees has been the coldest. And man, I get condensation on the inside everywhere. How do you deal with the winter?
Honestly, the condensation problem, I think, is kind of a boat by boat problem. Never once have I ever had an issue with condensation, but my boat is kind of unique in its design. It has an extra layer past the fiberglass that's like this foam insulation. So I really think that's kind of what saved me on it.
Mm,
But
yeah.
there's this material, I don't remember what it's called, but it's like a plasticky weaved thing that you put under all the cushions, and it creates like an air gap so air can get in, and so you don't have necessarily a mold problem. That being said, I've certainly run into people that have had this condensation type problem, but I've personally never had to deal with it.
Yeah. And what do you do for heat? You have a diesel heater or electric heater?
So in the winter, most of the time what people do is they have an electric heater and then they have like a secondary, what's called a Mr. Buddy, which is one of those portable propane heaters. And
Yes.
honestly, those Mr. Buddies are like, a fireplace, and it takes them nothing to really heat up. And even with just an electric heater on low, it'll heat up the boat fairly well. And that's kind of the advice I give every single liveaboard. Get yourself a Mr. Buddy and get yourself one of the fan electric heaters. You definitely need a
Yeah.
fan electric heater. They have like the oil ones that are just kind of like a radiator, but what you come to find out is because there's no heat being pushed out to fill the boat, it just goes straight up and into the roof. And also,
Yeah.
everyone does a shrink wrap too, but it's not the white shrink wrap. It's kind of a see-through shrink wrap, and that ends up creating a greenhouse effect on the boat, so that if it's sunny out, it'll bump up the boat several degrees and it'll create an extra layer that, condensation will go to that for sure.
Yeah. 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 I have one of those electric heaters on my boat. As a matter of fact, I'm going to the boat this weekend to start winterizing it. And it's time of year I take that electric heater. So you must be at a dock then if you're plugging in.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Um, you know, Everyone I know, even the most hardcore of all liveaboards, they all get onto a dock during the winter. I'm pretty sure like the marinas don't allow anyone to be on a mooring ball in the winter. They just say you got to be on the dock, and obviously the cost is relatively affordable in the winter time as compared to
Yeah.
the summertime.
Right. Right. So in the summer, are you on a mooring or are you in a dock all year?
Oh, I'm on a dock all year. I definitely like that type of lifestyle. I'm always doing something and always working, so the dock affords me easy on, easy off, all
Yeah.
the conveniences right there. I certainly know people that go onto a mooring ball, and seeing how they do it, I wouldn't recommend it, especially with Boston, because there's so much traffic that you're in a washing machine.
Yeah, that's right. Because you have all the ferries and stuff going out to the airport and all sorts of other places.
For sure.
So, do you have to worry about any pipes freezing in the winter in the boat? Do you have to winterize anything?
So in Boston, the water really doesn't freeze. It's still quite salty. And I've been there for, I don't know how long, and I've seen it at like -20 one time, but never once have I seen it freeze. Most of the problems of a boat sinking or a boat getting in trouble at the dock during the winter is because people will tie the water into the boat and just leave it on. And that water hose is the failure point. And so just how exposed it is connected to the boat, that part will break, and then it'll just dump water into the boat. That's how you sink. So, I don't have a direct hookup to the water, so I've never really had to deal with that. And I winterize the engine, and that's really about it.
I see. So you don't have to winterize any of your plumbing, your holding tank or your water tanks or your water lines. None of that freezes because it's warm enough on the boat and it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then plus, like, most of that stuff is below the water line. And so it's just, I was always under the impression that things don't freeze below the water line.
Yeah. 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 Well, that's good to know. It's one thing I've always kind of worried about. If I kept a boat in the water, do I have to winterize everything? But anyway, I take it out. It's coming out in another couple of weeks. So, like I said, I'm heading down there this weekend to do the engine and the water system. So, all right. So that's interesting so what other sort of tips would you have for someone who's maybe entertaining living aboard and not a warm climate? What's sort of your top 5 tips for somebody who's considering that?
Well, I feel like they kind of branch into just overall top tips, which, number one, buy a boat that is functional to begin with, doesn't have any problems. It's not going to be a task to get things done. I think that's number one, honestly. That's what kicks most people out. They get a boat and there's a ton of projects to do. Finding service businesses is somewhat impossible, / having the money to afford such service businesses is also a nightmare. And people just get hung up on stuff. Another thing that I've seen from liveaboards is that when you get a boat, almost the first thing that they want to do is waste all of their time and resources on kind of superficial things. Oh, I don't like this carpet. I don't like the color of the floor. I'm going to repaint this and repaint this. And so they spend a ton of money and a ton of energy on these superficial things instead of more functional, what do I need to do in order to be able to take this boat out as soon as the season ends? So I've seen that a lot. And, additionally, when you're a liveaboard, there is a community and everyone kind of suffers in their own way, and everyone's had their own unique projects. For instance, my teak decks. Well, I've managed to buy every single piece of power tool that one could have to work on teak decks. But that is the same thing throughout. Like, some guy might have all the equipment you need to install a head. Some guy has all the equipment to work on an engine. And if you go and you meet people and you become friends with them and you try to build a community, you have access to all these things. And, being on a boat can be pretty isolating at times, but it's the strength in the community that keeps you going.
Yeah, that's a great point you make about the community, because even in the marina I'm in, which is there's maybe about a half dozen liveaboards there during the summer. I don't think there's any there during the winter. We're up near Providence on Narragansett Bay, and but even there, like when I'm working on the boat, someone will stop by and say, "Hey, do you need anything? What are you working on? I got a tool for this." It is amazing how the sailing community comes together and sort of helps each other. And it's really remarkable because I've often thought that, man, if the rest of the world was that helpful and friendly, it would be a much better world to live in. You know?
I couldn't agree with you more. What I've
Yeah.
always told people, like people obviously ask me, oh, so what's it like to live on a board a boat and whatnot? And when you think about it, in the modern day, people living in homes, as time's gone on, people have become so separate and distant from each other that not everyone even knows their neighbors, right?
Right.
But in the marine world, it's like everyone has this weird shared passion. Everyone comes from such unique backgrounds that one wouldn't expect. Everything from brilliant scientists to damn near homeless, but everyone
Yeah.
like gets
Right.
together because hey, we're all boaters.
Right. Right. You have that one common bond that kind of breaks the ice, so to speak, on sort of opening the door to a conversation and building a relationship. Cool. Hey, so let's talk a little bit about if you've been hanging out in Boston, how long you've been there, what other places have you explored?
So the boat's been in Boston. I've lost track of time, right? It feels like time goes so slow on a boat. And I think it's like 6 or 7 years at this point. And I've always stayed at one marina. I know a few people that jump to marina each year, like a different one. Um, but yeah, I've been there for 7 years and I've sailed kind of all of the, up to Portland, pretty much, Portland, Maine, and kind of as far as New York. And that's really about it. I just kind of cruise in those areas. For the longest time, I was kind of going from girlfriend to girlfriend, and they weren't always the greatest sailors, meaning they would get seasick like instantly. And so that always lessened the range that I could actually do. But, things have changed. I got a girl that's actually a sailor. So, the distances that we can cover have certainly expanded.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. So let's talk a little bit about, let's say, Boston North. What's some of your favorite places to go, describe them, et cetera?
So Boston actually has 13 harbor islands in it. Most people don't even realize that. Everyone thinks it's just like open ocean or something. But each one of those harbor islands, it has a mooring field and you can anchor there. And it's far enough away from the city that you don't even feel like you're in Boston. It's like you escape to this other world for like a day and then you can come back to Boston, big city, do whatever you want. So certainly the harbor islands are awesome. The farther you go up north, kind of the next big marine place is Marblehead. And
Mm.
Marblehead is certainly known for its boating history and community. But I haven't much, stayed there. It's pretty jam-packed harbor. I've seen more boats on mooring balls in Marblehead than I've ever seen in one place. But there is an island that's off of a little bit farther north, off of Manchester by the sea, and it's called Misery Island, and that's one of my favorite spots. This small little island with a whole shipwreck history. There's Gloucester, which is a big fishing area that's quite popular. It's kind of industrial, and then a little bit farther north is Rockport, and Rockport, cute, quaint town. But as you know, most of the New England towns along the water are quite eclectic and beautiful in their own right.
Excellent. Excellent. So do you have any like tips for people who are sort of thinking about, okay, I'm going to go from, from Boston north up to Maine, maybe what sort of things do they need to think about from a sailing and boating perspective?
If I was going north from Boston, what I would do I would sail to Rockport, spend a night at Rockport, and then there's another island that's a little bit farther on the border of Maine. It's called Isle of Shoals, and I've heard that place is quite fantastic. And then from there, just a jump to Portland, Maine.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, are there navigation challenges and issues up that way? Is there a lot of commercial traffic?
There's really limited places to kind of anchor as you're going north. So you should really kind of have a plan on where you're going beforehand. And obviously there's certain seasons that you should decide to go up there, right? Like you shouldn't go up there while it's still winter or as it's
Right, right.
becoming winter. But other than that, it's a pretty easy sail. And obviously once you get into Maine, there's so many inlets, and the coast is so, like, if you factor in all the different zigs and zags that they have up
Right.
there, you could spend your entire life sailing through Maine, never even see the whole thing.
Yeah. 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 Excellent. And what about coming south? Did you go through the Cape? You must have gone through the Cape Cod Canal and
Yeah, so been through the Cape Cod Canal. I'm still kind of confused on how you really gauge it. For some reason, I wish these navigation books had like a better explanation besides ebb and flow and all this other type of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've gone through that. And recently I transported a boat from Martha's Vineyard over to New Bedford, which really wasn't that far, but I was able to experience kind of the how shallow it gets and how the waves can quite pick up in those shallow areas. But yeah, I mean, New England is New England.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just talking to a friend of mine who I saw the other day, and he went through the Cape Cod Canal 2 or 3 times this past summer. And he said on one of his trips, he was so proud of himself because he timed the current just right. So he had a following current pushing him through the canal, and he was so proud of himself because he finally figured out the tide charts, and the right time to go through. So he got like an extra 1.5 knot boost. But he said it was an awful trip because the wind was in the opposite direction. And he said the waves were incredibly tall and steep, and it was just awful. And he said, lesson learned, right? You got to think about not just the direction of the current, but also what's the direction of the wind, because those two things, as everyone says, highly interact with each other. Have you ever kind of come up through Narragansett Bay up that way?
I've sailed in those areas, and most of the time
Yeah.
I've been on other people's boats, right? But I mean, even this past one, when we were going from Martha's Vineyard to New Bedford, this guy calls me up. Oh, I could use your help to transport this boat, to New Bedford. And I was like, I didn't really want to do it, but the guy's my friend, so I had to do it. And I got out there, and I'm partially expecting, well, it's his boat. He's going to take it off the dock, right? And he's going to get it going, and yeah, I'll help him out and assist. And so we get there, and it's blowing like 35, 40 knots. And where this boat is docked is like sandwiched between all these other mooring balls. I'm sitting there being like, wow, this is going to be a nightmare. Thank God I don't have to take the boat off this dock. I wouldn't want to do it. And then the guy who owns the boat, he's like, Merrill, well, you're this big time sailor, so can you take it off the dock? And I was like, oh, are you sure you don't want to do it? You know this boat. He's like, no, you got it. And then everyone that is like a timeshare on this boat, like there's multiple owners, they're like, you got this, Merrill. And I'm sitting there like, oh my God, but I managed to get it off, not crash into anything. But it was certainly one of those type of things. And the next thing I'm thinking, oh my God, he's going to ask me to dock this thing. I don't even know where the hell we're going. But we managed to make it off the dock and onto the dock without a problem. Thank God.
Yeah, boy, I'm not jealous of you at all because each boat behaves differently, right? Cars, for the most part, all sort of go forward and backward about the same. But boats are very different. There's some boats that don't back up worth a crap, and others, are just the wind blows them. Other boats, the wind doesn't blow around very much. So each boat is really different. I know it's taken me, like a good year and a half to sort of feel comfortable maneuvering my boat around in the marina in sort of all sorts of wind conditions. It takes a while for that. So when you're going in cold, man, that's a lot of pressure.
Well, that certainly brings up one of the biggest issues within boating is the fear of docking.
Yes.
And that really is, I think, the thing that locks people onto the dock, right? It stops them from going out, this
Right.
anxiety of taking the boat out.
Right. Yeah. Particularly coming back, leaving the dock, most of the times, you can just kind of put it in gear and go, but it's getting back is the challenge. Yeah. I think you're right. A lot of people say, it's too windy, I'm not going anyplace. Not because it's too windy to go boating, but it's too windy to come back into the dock where they fear it. Yeah. Cool. Hey, so one of the other things that intrigued me about the email you sent me is that you have this entrepreneurial sort of streak in you, and you started a business, and that business is called ShipShape. And when I sort of looked it up a little bit, it sort of reminded me of the boater's version of Angie's List. So why don't you tell us about that and what the business is and what it does and the benefit to mariners and stuff?
Yeah, so at the core of it, ShipShape is very much an Angie's List, but for boats. And it's a very simple search tool where any boat or yacht owner can go in, do a search for a specific brand or service, and find a list of service businesses. I can't emphasize enough how much of a pain in the ass it is to find service businesses to begin with. But to bring it back, how I even got to the idea of building this in the first place was while I was at law school in Boston, I had run into this guy on the dock through the community that was there, and he was a liveaboard, and he was building out this multi-tool for dinghies, right? Essentially, it being that if you had a big enough dinghy, well, you're going to have a battery box to start the outboard. But those battery boxes were such pieces of junk, right? They're just like flimsy plastic. And at the core of it, it had a built-in bilge pump, right? Because one thing that happens with the dinghies is it fills up with water, and then it
Yep.
just is a nightmare to take out. So it was a built-in bilge pump. It had a big enough battery to start 150 horse. Bluetooth speakers, running light, fish finder, USB charging, all these different things. And, it was a progression. We're like, well, what else can we put on this thing?
Yeah.
And so we did that. We started to go through the whole trademark process. But I got to a point in which I realized that, wait a minute, like, how do you mass produce anything, right? And, obviously there's no clear path. There's no 1-800-China or what have you. And so while I was sitting there trying to really understand how to even do such a thing, I just had a community of boat owners, right? And I knew a ton of service businesses. And people would come up to me, oh, well, do you know a diver, a welder, engine mechanic, electrician, plumber? And I'd go to my list of people, and then I'd call them up and then connect the dots for people, and people would get the work done. And after I did that for a while, I was like, wait a minute, I should probably charge for this. And so then I started kind of doing general contracting where I had, all of this network of service businesses, and I had a ton of boats because the marine industry is very much word of mouth. And so, I was very fortunate. The stars aligned and I was able to build kind of this general contracting company. But from there, I went and decided to through hike another trail. So in 2018, I through hiked the Appalachian Trail. In 2020, I decided to through hike another trail called the New England Trail. It's from the coast of Connecticut to the Massachusetts, New Hampshire border. And I was out there in the woods for 22 days, and I was really thinking about how fortunate I was and all of this other type of stuff. And I said, wait a minute, why am I the youngest guy kind of doing this and having success? Then you realize that, well, everything is word of mouth. And because it's word of mouth, it stops people from actually getting into the industry. There's an unbelievable amount of people that actually want to work in the industry that have all these talents. But if you're not found, you're done
Right.
for. And so it only made sense in kind of the how to uplift and bring a younger generation in. There would have to be such a connecting tool that connects people together. obviously as time went on, started to realize that the issues were kind of throughout marine. It didn't matter if it was a new business trying to break in or an old business. There was just a myriad of problems throughout the whole how to build a business in service. And frankly, there's not a lot of people that represent the service industry. The trade associations don't really deal with them. Like, most of these guys don't even have websites. And then the ones that do, it's like, well, all the keywords that define, marine repair are very much to the home and auto industry that Google doesn't even know what the hell the difference is.
Right.
And so at the core of it, it's like connect the dots for people. It just, I believe that just the connectivity and the collaboration aspect of it revolutionizes how marine does. It gives opportunities for people to break in. It helps to create role models, which the service side of the industry is really lacking. Everyone's like, oh, well, we need to bring youth into the industry. But it's like you look around, you're like, well, what opportunity really is there? Like, who's really doing exceptional to be like a role model for this next generation?
Right. Yeah. As you were saying that, it just got me to thinking, like, if I wanted to start a business, let's say, marine plumbing systems, 30 years ago, basically what I did was I took an ad out in the Yellow Pages. That was it. And now, unfortunately, the Yellow Pages only came out once a year. So if you missed the window, you missed the window. But that's where people found services, was in what was called the Yellow Pages. But now it's much more complex than that. I mean, you have to have a website. You have to, show up in search engines. So there's all these other things that have, in many ways, increased the barriers to enabling someone to get in. So I think this whole notion of what you've done with ShipShape removes some of those barriers, right? It's a way for people to get on a list that people who are looking for those types of services know about and can utilize, which I think is great.
Yeah, and certainly one of the funny factors is, and I heard it from one of your previous podcasts, it was like, well, trying to find people in the first place. Well, the people that can be found are so booked up that they can never even come and work on your boat. And a lot of people, I've heard stories will be like, oh, there's just no service businesses, and the people that are there are just so booked up and it's going to take months. But I'd argue to say that there are a ton of businesses out there. You just can't find them. And everyone seemingly has their own like marina where they work at. And then, every marina has their own network of service businesses that essentially their business model is that boat owner has to go talk to boat owner at other marina before them even knowing about each other. Which, doesn't really happen.
Yep. This is great. So how does someone, let's say I'm a boater. I want to use this service. How do I do that? What do I need to do?
Well, you just go to www.ShipShape.pro and you do a search. It's a free to use tool at the present. As time moves on, because frankly, at this point, it's like we're trying to build the network and we're trying to build the marketplace. And we've had some decent success. We're working with 2,000 to 3,000 boats each month, but that's on a national scale, and there's like 17 million boats out there, so it's tiny. But we also have 2,200 service businesses across the U.S., and there's no bigger directory of that. And I tell you, it was quite a monumental task to build out such a directory in the first place. It took me a solid year of research and trying to figure out who existed. And frankly, it was almost like running into a ton of tombstones. Here lies Bob's Mobile Marine,
Yes. Yeah. Well, and so let's say I'm on the other side. Let's say I'm on a service provider. I do marine air conditioning or whatever. How do I get connected from that perspective?
Yeah, you just go in, there's a sign up feature, you click it, you put in your business details, and then there's kind of like a clickable what services you actually do, defined by main category, subcategory, and brand. I guess the easiest way to think about it is engine is main category, inboard, outboard, stern drive or subcategory, and then you have like Yanmar and Yamaha and Suzuki and all of those. But to tell you kind of some stories on building that, no one prior to us had actually made like a keyword tree for marine repair, right? And so it's just like now we're having to build a search engine for it, in which this tool needs to understand the difference between, if someone's searching for engine repair, that's kind of a very soft search, what type of engine. And, you get to inboard and out, yeah, it's still a better search, but it's like, how do you have the system parse through what someone could say, where it's like, Yanmar, inboard repair. Well, the thing had to be able to parse through the words and then find which word was the strongest for the search.
Right.
But yeah, that was quite something. And I tried to go to like companies like West Marine and look at how they structured things, and I was just like, oh, there is no commonality. Like no one really thought of this. So that was certainly a struggle. And it went through so many iterations too. It's like I'd go through 200 business websites and try to figure out what they did. And I'll tell you that no one really tells you what they do, right? They say, oh, we do everything related to repair. And we'd onboard some service businesses and we'd be like, okay, so what type of engines you work on? They're like, work on all engines. And I'm like, come on, you don't work on all engines. They're like, oh yeah, we do. And then they look at the list and there's so many different engine brands. They're like, well, I guess I do that one, and I could do that one, but I wouldn't want to do that. And then they just like click it. They only got 3 of the 30 that are there.
Right. Well, what you're talking about is so important because as a user of those types of services, and maybe it's my ADD kicks in, but I don't have a lot of patience for sort of going someplace and I'm searching for something, and after 2 or 3 searches, if I can't find it, that's it. I'm gone. I'm not going back to that place anymore. So doing that in a way that works and is very effective and productive is really key, I think, to a lot of these types of search endeavors, not only for the customer like me, if I'm looking for that service, but the person on the other side, to make sure that they narrow their list of skills down enough so that they do pop up in the appropriate search. And not like, wait, I'm not looking for that. How did that company end up here? So that's great.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with finding people in the first place, as every person that, if they're listening to this podcast, owns a boat, it's like, oh, you try to do searches and then all of a sudden you're stuck on forums that were made in 2003 and you're trying to read through it. You're like, oh, well, this person in 2003 was alive, maybe he can do this. And then you try to do some searches and you can't find anything. But I'll tell you one success story, which was also myself too, right? So we talk about the issues of docking. Well, my Toshin Toshiba 36, it had 4,500 hours on it, right? She's been worked hard, right? And it was a progression of issues. Basically, when you'd go to put her in gear, the gear shifter felt like it was nothing, right? Like it would just slide and nothing would happen. The boat wouldn't go into gear. And as it got worse and worse and worse, the last time I come in, I go to dock and I'm just like, I'm trying it out before I'm even at the marina. I put it in gear, it works. Put it in reverse, it works. I'm like, okay, I got this. I come in, I go to put it in reverse to back up. Nothing happens. I just start floating down the marina next to all these boats. I'm like, oh my God. And then of course, some dinghies save me. 3 dinghies come out of the dock and tow me back to my slip. And I'm sitting there and I'm just like, oh, my world is over, right? Like every major project I've ever had, I'm like, oh my God, this is what kills me. And so I'm like, oh, what the hell am I going to do? How am I going to find anyone? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, Wayne, I just built this whole platform. I totally have the answers right here. So I went and I did a search. And I was able to schedule a haul out, bottom paint, new transmission, new prop shaft, new cutlass bearing, new prop, new heat exchanger, new hoses from 3 separate companies. And I got it all done in 3 days. Everything was done in 3 days, which is like unheard of, right? Because that'll kill your entire season. You get any one of those problems. But just finding the right people that wanted to work, and it all panned out quite well.
Yeah. So it was ShipShape.pro, correct?
Yeah, PRO.
PRO.pro. Yeah. Is that an app or is it a website or both?
It's a website.
Okay.
We're still a startup, and we have a solid team, and we have a little bit of investment, and we have some good board people, right? We have the founder of Dakwa, he's on our team. We have the senior vice president of One Water, he's on our team. So it's one of those gradual type things. And
Super.
certainly as time goes on and it evolves, it'll become, something else. But at the present, it's just a very kind of basic search, right? You come in, you search for what you're looking for, and you get results, and then you can call them and figure out how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. That sounds wonderful. Sounds like a great asset for mariners. So, Merrill, you've been a great guest. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have?
Well, I certainly have a podcast.
Oh, yeah. Talk about that.
Yeah. So our podcast is called ShipShape International Ocean Insights. And when we first started the podcast, it was very much in the mentality of, oh, well, if we do this, this will help drive traffic to the platform. And as we started to do these interviews, we kind of realized that we had a completely different demographic than the people that use the platform, and that the people that were listening to it were CEOs and founders and owners of marine companies. And as you probably already know this, there was like a fear of, oh, well, who would talk to me on this podcast, right? Like, oh, I'm just a nobody, right? Reach out to some big names.
Right.
And one of the first big names that we had was Robert Perry, right? I just, made a post and on Robert Perry's fan page, and he was like, this is not allowed, right? This is some advertisement. It's not related to me. And I said, well, Bob, you're the guy who was, because of you and inventing all these boats, she was able to do this. And he's like, you know what? You got a point. I was like, you should come on to our podcast. And then after that, he was like, sure. And so that was our first heavy hitter. But what makes us kind of unique, and I heard this on another one of your podcasts, but we cover main topic marine. So everything from super yachts to aquaculture, from NOAA to MIT. So we cover all sorts of different things. We're not really focused on one particular subject, like, sailing or anything like that. And it's been, unique in the sense that when you talk to so many different sectors of marine, you come to find out that everyone's got the same problems, but no one wants to communicate. It's like a color wheel where each color is its own sector, whether it be shipping or aquaculture or recreational boating or, what have you. And everyone's trying to solve the same problems. Like, for instance, workforce development. Everyone is trying to solve that. And then you talk with MIT, they're like, oh, we came up with a solution for that. And all these people are so siloed. And it's like, what? You're siloed, right? It's like you haven't given this to anyone else, right? Like about how to figure out this whole workforce thing. And so that's been unique, and it's put me into so many different positions, as to be on boards for super yacht companies and stuff like that. I mean, the extent of my super yacht knowledge is just through the guests I interview, but it's been certainly a journey on that front.
Well, that's fantastic. So that was ShipShape International Insights.
Yeah, International Ocean Insights. We were really trying to pad the books on the keywords.
Yes, well, that's important. Very good. So, Merrill, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and maybe I'll see you out there sometime.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, Bela, another interesting interview. So what struck you most about your conversation with Merrill?
Oh, gosh, there was a lot of things there. I think this notion of living in a marina full time is interesting, right? I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time at the marina where we have our boat, and There's probably during the summertime, there's probably about a half a dozen folks who live on their boats there full time. I will say that all of them head south for the winter. So I don't believe there's anyone living there full time during the winter months. And there is this little community that sort of builds up and supports each other. So I thought that was an interesting that Merrill talked about, right? This notion of living in marina and then sort of liverboards, particularly the ones that are there in the winter, all sort of band together and they sort of help each other because they know they build that community. And you and I have talked about this in the past, that the sailing community and the boating community in general is just really great. And they help each other. And, you know, there's many instances where someone's seen me working on my boat and they ask me if I need a hand or if I need any tools or anything like that. And in normal life, that doesn't happen very often. The other thing I thought that was interesting.
And then this is a subset, right? It's a subset of these
That's
boaters that, right?
That's right.
It's this neat sub-community or subculture, which is even more tight probably.
Oh yeah, I think it's extremely much tighter because they all have this really common bond of we're all a little crazy because we're living on our boats in the wintertime. And the other thing I thought was interesting was he was saying it's probably a low cost way of living downtown in a big city. Because we all know how much apartments are in New York, and I'm sure in Boston they're the same. There's several $1,000s for an apartment that's probably smaller than your boat. And so now you have a boat and you can live on it for probably cheaper than in an apartment. So I thought that was sort of an interesting thing. And you Boston
can travel
and all
with it too, which is kind of cool,
right?
Right? You can take it out and you can go explore the Harbor Islands, or you can go up to the coast of Maine, or you can go down to the
That's
Cape, right?
That's right. That's one of the nice things about Boston is, from a sailing New England perspective, it really is sort of centrally located. Right? You can get up to Maine pretty easy. You can come south down into Long Island Sound or Narragansett pretty easily. And that's one of the wonderful things about sailing in the Northeast. So that's sort of the things that struck me. What struck you from our conversation?
Well, maybe looking at it from the business standpoint, right, is I'm always interested in platform businesses, right? And we all know from eBay and, what am I thinking of? I don't know why my
Angie's List. Were you thinking of Angie's List?
Sure, Angie's List, and right that you talked about, and there's lots of different platforms for bringing people together in an online way. These are multi-sided business models, we call them, right? So you've got a couple things going on. You're trying to match up. You want to have the right sellers and the right number of buyers, because if you have too many sellers and no buyers, they're not going to stick around. And if you've got too many buyers and no sellers, they're not going to stick around. So in this case, you've got to have the service providers who are providing the marine services, and you have to have the boat owners or the ship owners who want to buy this. And getting that mix just right is a really tricky thing. And so, this looks to me like it's got a really pretty good user base. It's still in the startup phases, but they've got both people on their platform, the buyers and the sellers. So they've really accomplished that first kind of key step. And the other thing that's cool is these marketplaces allow you to take what's called the long tail. Okay. So if you're a marina, you only have a certain amount of space and you only have a certain number of employees. So to do certain services, you're limited, right? Like I think you talked about once, like the person that does the upholstery, right? In your cabin, right? On your boat. And this gives all these specialty providers, right, that maybe you only need once every 5 years or something like this, right, into one place where you can always know you can find these little specialty providers. So we call this kind of the long tail. You can find somebody at every marina to do engine work or to do hull work or painting or whatever. But some of these little specialties, it's really nice to have a place that you can one location for all this stuff. So I think he's got a pretty good chance of making this work, right? It's a pretty cool idea. And it seems like there's buyers and sellers and there's a need because there's lots of these little niche work that needs to get done. And there's a market need for it. So I don't know. So I was really impressed with the concept. And I always like to see small business people taking something they're passionate about. In this case, the marine world for Merrill, and turning it into a cool business that helps both buyers and sellers. And he makes a little money on the whole thing for the idea and making it happen. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, Mike. I think it's a great idea, because I think finding service providers in sort of the marine industry is not an easy thing. It's still sort of done the old-fashioned way. You go into Google and you put in marine toilet systems or marine plumbing, and you see what pops up. And one of the great things of a service like Angie's List is that it brings focus to that, and it brings an ability for you to zoom in quickly and find specialties and subspecialties, which I think typically works much better than Google. At least for me, I have found those services to be very helpful. And I think what Merrill's put together here with ShipShape.pro is a great example of that. It's focused on the marine industry, and it's a great way to match up buyers and sellers. There are people who want service and people who are selling services. And a boat, once you start getting larger boats, it's as complex as a house. My boat has, actually has two electrical systems. It has a 12-volt electrical system and a 115-volt electrical system. It's got two engines. It's got two bathrooms. It's got plumbing. It's got water. It's got a water heater. It's got air conditioning. It's got heat. It's got lights. So it's just as complicated as a house. And in many ways, it's much more difficult to work on than a house because stuff is buried. It's much more specialized. I can't go to Home Depot. I can't go to Lowe's to kind of buy the parts for this. And I can't just call up my local plumber or my local electrician to do these types of things. The codes are different for marine plumbing and marine electrical work. So I think it's a great way of doing it. And the marina I'm at, sort of provides some level of service. But think about it this way. Think about it. I'm a cruiser. I don't live in a marina. I travel from area to area, or I'm living on the anchor. And something goes wrong and I need some help. This is a great thing for that because, I can talk to the people who are anchored around me and say, hey, do you know of anybody who does this? But that exchange is solely based on their experience, which may be great, or it may be even more limited than mine with using those services. So I think this is really great for all sorts of boaters, ones living in a marina, or ones like myself who, live in a house but go to the marina but still have a boat that has things that need to get fixed on it. And I think it particularly useful for people who are more mobile and not living in one place and don't build up that network of people to, like you do with a house. Once you've lived in your house for a number of years, you sort of know who the local good plumber is because you talk to your neighbors and who the good electrician is. But in a boat, it's much harder. So I think it's really great.
Yeah, and it's a pretty slick interface and looks like it's pretty easy to use. So yeah, really kind of a cool thing. So I would say, listeners, check it out. Interesting guy, interesting conversation. Thanks for doing it. What do you think? Wrap this one up?
Yep. Sounds good, Mike. Let's wrap her up.
All right. Listeners, once again, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. We hope you found this conversation interesting and thought-provoking. And as always, if you have questions about what we've discussed or have some ideas on what we should be talking about, let us know. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
Yeah, we're recording this at the end of October, Mike, and it's getting colder. Almost all the leaves are gone. I was out at the boat and got it winterized and ready to get hauled out this past weekend. So the sailing season is over, and pretty soon I'll be dusting off the skis and getting ready to ski. So, but I still have some good episodes coming up here in the future. Got a couple of good, interesting people lined up to talk to. So until next time, signing off from upstate New York. See you all soon.
Thanks, Bela. It's always a pleasure. And from over here in Münster, Germany, I'll see you next time. Okay.
Okay. Stop recording. Stop.